Any Reasonable Person by Jay Wilburn. The spirit of Count Basinger floated up behind Dorothy's head, even though she had pushed her chair flush against the wall. This was almost over, he was sure. She sat far from the fire with her eyes wide with both fear and disbelief. She wanted this to all be untrue, some vision brought on by too much wine or too little sleep, Basinger was sure. He did not hate Dorothy, no more than he despised any of the living. She reminded him of one of his aunts, who had been such fun when she was young, but grew more addled over the years. This was his house, though. Death might steal it from him in the legal sense, but in spirit, as he found himself now, this would always be his home, his haunt. So, like his aunt, she had to go. Basinger breathed out his cold dead words into her ears. The small hairs there moved and then stood up, prickled straight. You need to go, Dorothy. This is your last chance. It wasn't true, of course. If she chose to stay, he would find some other way to scare her off, just like all the ones before her. But the dramatic was what being a ghost was all about. She started to shake until the wood of her chair creaked and popped. She almost tipped the thing over. And Basinger was so surprised by the convulsive force of her fear that he actually reached out with his transparent hands to catch her if he could. She'd likely fall right through, but he could manipulate objects in the real world if he concentrated. He was one of those spirits, and he did not want her dying in his house. Let her go haunt some other space. This one was taken. Dorothy found her feet, and though she wavered horribly, she stayed upright all the way down the hall, out the front door, and through the estate grounds, screaming bloody murder, as the saying goes. She did not even bother to pack her things before she left the house for the last time. Basinger had told her this was her last chance, and to her credit, she believed him. Her things were quite expensive, though, and Basinger never expected her to leave them. Working men with little time to indulge fear when money was involved returned to move her things out. Basinger watched from the upstairs railing. He supposed he needed to let them finish their work. Scaring them off would only prolong Dorothy's ultimate eviction from his life, so to speak. He could not let them leave without some fear of the place. Working men were a superstitious lot, but they also had children and neighbors who were tempted by abandoned houses, sometimes tempted because they were rumored to be haunted. It would do no good to let these men tell tales of how old Dorothy was out of her mind. Basinger moved along the railing to a loose board along one of the adjoining walls. As they hauled out her final dresser, Basinger concentrated and pulled that board free. It clattered to the floor and frightened the movers nicely. They exchanged a look, discussed investigating, and then decided to leave in a hurry. That would do fine. Basinger had to concentrate even harder to move the board back into place. Fixing things was always more difficult and involved than tearing them apart. This was true in life and the afterlife. Basinger's estate was coming apart on its own much faster than he cared for, even without his help. The last little scare backfired a little. Lots of kids wanted to come see that haunted house. He could usually send them away screaming, but they kept coming back for more. It was tiring even for a spirit that no longer required sleep. The problem was, scene break, the problem was that no matter how many times he scared away, the property would always belong to someone. Dorothy might be willing to get rid of it, but someone would take the deal to buy it up, and probably at a discount. Count Basinger was well aware that if he did too good of a job scaring people out of the house, one day someone would simply knock the place over and sell the land for some crass development. Would Basinger haunt the empty land or the new structure? Perhaps some garish department store full of all sorts of people he despised in life and after. Maybe the destruction of the house would finally free him to go to wherever cloudy afterlife had so far been denied him. Who could say? Death and haunting did not come with an instruction manual. Basinger had been raised to fear God and memorize his word. None of those verses prepared him for this. It had not prepared him for his mother to be carted off to the same asylum as his fun aunt. It had not prepared him for the loss of his sister so early in life either, but people love to quote the Bible at times like that. Still, all those were problems for the living, and he had his own problems now. He hated Mr. Grigsby, though. Grigsby had money. That was no virtue, and anyone buying up an estate would have to have some. He was a fat man. He was a loud man. Even when he was home alone, he was loud, crude, and prone to vice. Count Basinger would certainly be happy to be spared the private habits of this brute. As Mr. Grigsby laid in bed, ready to indulge himself yet again, Basinger pulled out one of his darkest tricks. This was likely an emergency, after all. Grigsby had to go, and he needed to be gone tonight. No more rattling chains or slamming doors. This was going to be an exorcism of the living. With no body, Basinger seldom felt anything, but as he leaned hard into this supernatural effort, his mind and soul ached with deep pain. Moisture gathered in droplets along the walls and started running down, dripping onto the uneven boards of the bedroom floor. Grigsby reacted to the noise and the odd drop in temperature, but could probably still write it off as the old house being leaky and drafty. "Well, explain away this, you awful man," Basinger growled. The moisture seeping out of the walls took on a bloody hue. Then Basinger reached, stretching the material of the wall as if it were elastic or some sort of sheet. Grigsby literally sat up and took notice. Basinger opened his mouth to show his teeth in the stretching plaster and aging wood slats underneath. He set his eyes upon the living man as they stared at each other. Grigsby rolled out of bed and struck his head on the wet floor, adding real blood to the supernatural vision. The man struggled with his pants around his ankles, but still managed to get to his feet to flee. Basinger added a cackling laugh that he would have never given in life, but ghosts had to use the fears of the living to get results. The house stood empty for a couple decades. It decayed to the point that Basinger almost wished someone would finally tear it down to put it out of its misery. It was his home, though. It had been his father's home, his grandfather's home, and his great-grandfather's home before all of them. Where the hell were their ghosts? As far as he could tell, he haunted this place alone. They had not cared enough to stick around following death. It was left to him. He had fought to keep it all his life, and he was still fighting for it a century after his death. He knew no other existence now. Xander Kinger was something different. His hair was green when he moved in. It was blue later, which also reminded Basinger of his fun but addled aunt. The man was renovating the house itself. That probably saved money, but he had to have come by some money somewhere, some way, to afford to own and fix up the estate. But then also to lay around all day, watching TV, playing video games, and riding that damn skateboard, both inside and out, like he owned the place. He did own the place on paper, but it was still disrespectful. Basinger had shorted out the computers in the gaming room, which used to be a private dining room off the master. Every time Xander had more computers ordered and installed without missing a single stream. Like Grigsby arguing with himself out loud before him, Xander spent much of his time talking to the computers as if they could talk back. The Count wasn't a stupid man. He observed new technology and partially understood it, even being so far displaced from his own time, but he simply never would comprehend it all completely, he concluded. Basinger tried again. "Get out or I'll end you, boy." Nothing. No reaction. At least none Basinger cared for. No running or screaming. He was sure Xander had heard. The boy shivered, but then just laughed, like he was used to hearing threatening voices out of nothing or from inside his own head. Basinger thought of his aunt and his own mother again. For the first time in over a century of nonstop contemplation, he considered that his mother's decline had really begun just after the untimely death of his sister. His father had been no help as she dealt with that loss while comforting him and the other children. Even accounting for different times and different customs, his father owed the woman some kindness, some loving care, instead of the cold emptiness Basinger men thought of as manliness. He was starting to believe that only insane men and women bought haunted houses. This house in particular seemed to be haunted by far more than mere ghosts. He tried the bleeding, stretching walls trick too. That had to scare off anyone, but Xander Kinger simply held up a small recording device until Basinger had spent all his energy on the wasted effort. Xander actually seemed disappointed when the device glitched out and failed to record the event. Count Basinger was at a loss. What else could he do? After all that, slamming doors and knocking over loose boards seemed like quite a letdown. Xander was a heavy sleeper. For the few hours he did crash every night. When he was up at the wee hours renovating or gaming, he laughed off every noise and apparition that Basinger could manage. As Xander climbed a ladder to connect the wiring to the new electric light in the formal dining room, now sporting skating ramps, Basinger decided it was time to push over the ladder. This would take a lot of energy and effort, but he could think of no other motivator at this point beyond a real threat to life. He was fully aware he might be dooming himself to an afterlife with the punk co-haunting with him. That would be almost as bad as an afterlife with Grigsby, but this Xander Kinger character needed to be convinced. The ladder wobbled. Finally, one metal and rubber foot lifted up and came back down. Xander still had time to climb down to safety. With the ladder lighter, Basinger thought he might be able to tip it over now, but Xander took hold and locked some connector to the floor, which made the ladder immobile to Basinger's fullest strength. That was quite an advance in ladder technology from Basinger's time, and probably kept a few more ghosts from entering the world, but it didn't help him now. "Nice try, Ghosty," Xander said, "but this electrical is going in whether you like it or not. The future is now, my friend." Basinger took a step back as best he could without a body. Xander was looking in his direction, but not directly at him. "Can you hear me? Can you see me, boy?" Xander took another look around as if he had sensed something, but still not really at Basinger himself. The boy climbed the ladder again, and Basinger spent the whole night trying to tip it over, but no luck. Xander even painted the ceiling. All that great original tile work up there, no small fortune in Basinger's great-grandfather's time, and he just painted over it like that history was something to be covered. It was in rough shape, but still, respect, history. As Xander lay down to sleep mid-morning, Basinger prepared to slam doors and to keep the boy awake as punishment. The ghostly count felt so spent himself, though, but he could probably still slam as many doors as he liked. He was that sort of spirit, but what was the point? Xander Kinger was determined. He seemed to know the place was haunted and only found it to be amusing. With Xander snoring, his skin and long blue hair still spotted with tacky eggshell white paint, Basinger retreated to a far dark corner in the unrenovated portions of the house. Light cut through the unpatched holes in the wall and beamed upon the dirty floors. What was Basinger fighting to no avail? What was to be gained? Did it matter if Xander or someone else renovated the place? Whether he moved in or sold it off, what difference did any of this make? Count Basinger wished he could sleep, wished he could sink into oblivion for a little while, if not permanently. Instead, he sulked in the dirty darkness of his own forgotten estate. All right. He was going to the pool again. Basinger could not bear it. He followed behind the boy, shouting at his back. It was tough to be seen or felt in the outdoor daylight. Basinger could walk the grounds nearest the house, but he grew very thin when he did so. Still, he managed to pull down the branches of the overgrown landscaping to swat the boy on his helmet. Xander laughed that off too and said, "I need to remember to get those trimmed." "How about you just get out of my house, you pest?" No reaction. Xander tipped over the edge of the empty pool and started his never-ending one-man skate party. It was better than when all Xander's friends were over skating, but Basinger still hated it. It was nice that the black water had been drained and the walls of the pool cleaned of slime. But why not put water back in? Why use it for skating when he already used the walks and the hallways too? "You don't belong here." Xander laughed again as he completed some aerial feat. Whether he was laughing at his own success or Basinger's impotent anger, the ghost couldn't tell. The boy stuck his tongue out like some maniac as he completed another trick on the other side of the pool. On the next leap off the wall, Basinger swatted at the board. Xander came down wrong and took a tumble. He was wearing pads, but still bled on the concrete once he rolled to a stop. "Got you, boy. There's more where that came from." "I'm sure." Xander returned to his feet, retrieved his board, and started up again. Had he heard? Was he hearing all along and just ignoring Basinger's ranting? Was he too far up into his own head to be deterred? Basinger knocked the board out of line again and again. Xander fell over and over, but kept getting back up. Maybe if the ghosts were in a different mood, he might even respected this tenacity. Eventually, Xander compensated and started spinning the board every time Basinger tried to knock him down. The ghost gave up and just laid in the bottom of the pool day and night for some time. He might have stayed there forever if the pool hadn't been filled with water again. Basinger rose out of the clear water and made his way to the house that now looked quite different on the outside. Even the landscaping was changed. It was clean, but very understated, not nearly grand enough for an estate like this. Xander looked odd with a natural hair color that was starting to go a little gray. He still had tattoos that showed above his collar. None of the businessmen who stopped by seemed to care. Xander made money with the computers in some way that Count Basinger was never going to understand. His time, the world he knew and thought he understood, had passed him by long ago. Basinger found himself thinking more and more about his long-dead family. Where were they? Especially the ones who had died young. What became of them? He hoped they were not alone like he had been all these many years. If he had ever married and had children of his own, would he have watched the generations of his own family grow up here instead of strangers? Xander Kinger's wife was nice enough. His kids were a little wild, but the family seemed happy. Basinger would not have gone with many of the style choices of the renovation, but he had to admit it was better than the place simply falling apart. Also, what would I do about it? Are you sad again, Mr. B? Basinger turned to see the boy. Sterling was his name, staring at him. Basinger sighed and looked away. I'm fine. Run along and leave me alone, boy. My mom doesn't believe you're real, the boy said. My dad does, I think, but she says we're making it up. Could you scare her one time just so she knows? A dog barked somewhere outside. Basinger shook his head, such as it was. I've tried. She's immune to everything I have. Nothing will get you guys out of here anyway. Why would you want us to leave? Basinger thought about answering, but deep down he hardly remembered why any of it ever mattered to him in the first place. If he did run out this family, someone else would just move in. They might be worse, the way Mr. Grigsby had been. May his long-dead soul never pop up anywhere Basinger haunted. Before he had to say anything or drift off through some wall to get the boy to leave him alone, the dog started barking even louder at back. Oh, they had a dog too, and it tended to growl if Basinger stayed around the family too much. Some mutt that was mostly golden retriever that had an open mouth, panting smile that made him look stupid. One more annoyance. This sounded different, though. The dog was afraid. Its barks, these barks, made the air jagged in a way only a spirit like Basinger could see. Sterling seemed to feel it too, though. Basinger didn't like it one bit. He didn't expect to save the dog if it had decided to disturb something venomous out there, but he soared through the wall, insulation, and wiring to fly out over the grounds to investigate anyway. On the way through, he spotted some roaches moving inside the walls. Those would need to be treated before they got worse. Basinger decided to tell the boy to mention it to his father once the dog was settled again. Basinger grew thin, and he felt thin when he saw what had Bones the dog so upset. How long had she been under there, the girl, Sterling's younger sister, Apricot? Terrible name for a child, but she was the sweetest of the lot. She reminded Basinger of his youngest sister before she died of a weak heart. That's what they called it back then. Everything had changed for the worse after that. That's who Basinger thought of as he dove into the pool and concentrated all his energy on taking hold of her where she lay so still upon the concrete bottom. She felt heavier than the latter, maybe heavier than the whole world. Basinger actually prayed for the first time since he had been very young, definitely the first time since he had died more than a century earlier. She started to move. As he hauled her up very slowly, he could see his own body wavering within the water. He wondered if others might be able to see it too. Maybe even Sterling and Apricot's mother, Xander's wife. He focused on the work, though. There was an actual splash as he broke the surface. He wondered if that was just her or the both of them. The dog's frantic barking was clear again. Basinger's spirit and soul were in pure agony. He couldn't keep this up much longer. Help me, Mutt. Come on, Bones. Help me save her. The dog extended its snout and took hold of the edge of her soaked shirt. The animal bore down and pulled backward. It was enough that Basinger could haul the girl up onto the edge. Sterling was out there screaming bloody murder, as the saying went. Go get your father. Hurry, boy, go. Sterling heard and obeyed. He ran away, the way Basinger could never get his father to do. The girl wasn't breathing. He could almost see her spirit pulling away. He imagined her being trapped in that house with him. The boy and the dog might see her, but she would never grow up, and her mother would never see her again. Mrs. Kinger would not recover from it, he knew. He considered just for a moment, that this loss might be the one haunting thing that would finally drive the Kingers out of his home finally. Basinger bore down himself like the dog had done and tipped Apricot up onto her side. Some water came out of her mouth, but she still wasn't breathing. He could feel his strength slipping as the sunlight passed through him. The agony swelled until it pounded inside his non-existent skull, and in the roots of his teeth he no longer possessed. Moisture beaded up around the shape of his figure. It defined him in his pain and effort. He reached his ghostly fingers through her back. The dog whined but did not growl at him this time. He could feel the water. Sweeping his fingers through, more belched out of her mouth. He felt her little heart, too. Basinger squeezed once. He squeezed harder a second time, then a third. The suspended droplets of moisture swelled into fat rain, then turned red and bled heavy off of him to stain the concrete around him and the dead girl. Little Apricot coughed up more water and rolled to her stomach as she started crying. Basinger felt her heart beating against his insubstantial fingers before he drew his hand out of her back. She called for her mother and father in that order before gagging and crying some more. The dog licked her cheek and then moved to lick Basinger, but just succeeded in passing through him and whining. I appreciate the gesture just the same, Bones. The dog barked once and ran out to meet the family as they ran for the pool. Basinger's pain melted back to nothing. The vision of red stains around him vanished as well. It was a stupid trick anyway. The mother scooped up Apricot and held her tight as she returned to the house crying herself. She had a phone in her pocket, Basinger knew, that she could use to call for proper help. She was never without her phone, but seemed to forget it now. Someone needed to remember to call for help. The boy shouted, "Thank you, Mr. B," and he followed his mother. "Tell her to call someone, a doctor." He thought about mentioning the roaches in the wall, but decided now wasn't the time. Bones sat at Basinger's feet as Xander, an older man now, but usually with an annoyingly youthful spirit, looked well beyond his years in that moment of almost losing his daughter. As the man stared down into the water, Count Basinger decided Kinger was the kind of man he wished his father had been. The ghost hovered there, thinking about the sister he had been powerless to save in life, and how he had felt Apricot's heart start up in his hand. It was a strong heart, one that refused to give up easily. He hoped as much anyway. Sunlight caught the dog's fur in such a shimmering golden glow that the ghost had to wonder whether it was real or imagined. The dog's mouth was closed tight, and his eyes mournful. No stupid panting grin today. Even the mutt knew how serious this all was. How close the call had been. Why was the animal just sitting there, though? Basinger turned his head, dazzled by the sun for an instant, to see Xander looking in his general direction. "You should drain that pool again and go back to skating." "Thank you, Mr. B." Xander Kinger turned away and followed after his family. Basinger lingered a bit longer and then returned to the house they shared. Bones followed along by his side.